それではお待たせいたしました。本日の記者会見を始めさせていただきたいと思います。私、企画委員の朝日新聞の宮田でございます。今日のゲストはですね、核不拡散、核軍縮に関する国際委員会の川口理子さんとエバンス両コーチェア、両議長による記者会見でございます。で、皆様のお手元に、このメディアパックというのが大体、言ってるかと存じます。で、本日、このコミッションが検討されてきた結果が最終報告にまとまりまして、両共同議長がですね、首相官邸で、鳩山首相、並びにオーストラリアのラッド首相に最終報告書を提出されました。で、その内容について、今日は会見をしていただくということです。で、この国際委員会について若干、インフォメーションを提供しておきますと、昨年の7月に、オーストラリアのラッド首相が日本に来られました。で、その際に、核軍縮、核不拡散についての国際委員会を作ろうということをラッド首相の方から提案されまして、日本側の首相もこれに応じて、この委員会ができました。で、以後、世界を代表するような政治家、あるいは核問題の専門家をメンバーにしてですね、世界各地でヒアリングや検討会などを行って、実はちょうど2か月前、今年の10月ですね、広島で会合を開く際に、ほぼ骨格がまとまったということで、お二人に当クラブに来ていただきまして、骨格について記者会見をしていただきました。本日はその最終報告書について発表していただきたいと思います。それではまず川口さん、それからエバンスさんの順番で、短くオープニングリマークスをしていただき、その後会場の皆様からご質問をお受けしたいと思います。それでは川口さん、よろしくお願いいたします。
ありがとうございます。今日はお忙しい中をお集まりいただきましてありがとうございます。ただいまお話ございましたように、この国際委員会は今まで4回の本会合、そして4回の地域会合を経まして、先ほど報告書をラッド首相および鳩山首相に総理にお渡しをしてまいりました。ここに至るまでにお世話になりました、あるいはご協力、ご貢献をいただいた大勢の委員の方、諮問委員会の方、そしてNGO、市民社会の方々に厚く御礼を申し上げます。委員会は今後、報告を作りました後、政府や議会や、そして市民社会の方々に取り組みの重要性を直接に働きかけていくために、運動体として活動をしていく所存でございます。で、この一環として、関係国の政府への個別説明、あるいは主事の国際会議での場でアピールをするなどの国際的なアウトリーチ活動を展開をしていこうと思っています。この関連で来年1月のダボス会議におきましては、核軍縮・不拡散のセッションを設けるという予定にしておりまして、この報告書については、その場でも議論をされることになっております。報告書の中身については、具体的に後ほど、エバンズ共同議長からお話があると思いますので、私はその何が特徴であるかということを中心にお話をさせていただきたいと思います。今まで東京、あるいはキャンベラコミッション、東京フォーラムという形で出ておりまして、それと比較して何が新しいかということですけれども、まず核軍縮の機運が高まる中で非常にタイムリーに出される報告書であるということでございます。それからもう一つ、非常に包括的なアプローチをしている報告書であるということです。核軍縮、核不拡散、この2つは今までの先ほど申し上げた東京フォーラムでもキャンベラコミッションでもカバーしていますが、それに加えて、NPT のもう一つの柱である、 平和的な利用についても含んでおりますし、それから4本目といたしまして、核セキュリティの問題も検討をいたしました。3番目に、理想的かつ野心的であると同時に現実的であり、そして実際的であるということでございます。政府の2歩先を歩こうということでやってまいりました。4番目に、専門家でない一般市民の方にとって読みやすい、分かりやすい報告書であるということを心がけました。5番目に、行動指向型であるということでして、具体的な勧告とレコメンデーションと、それから行動計画、アクションプログラムを提示をいたしております。分析もありますが、そこのところを読めば何をしていくかということが分かりやすく、時間をかけないでそこが理解できるという形になっております。6番目に今まで出ました報告書というのは、核兵器の量ですとか能力を問題にしてまいりました。で、この委員会におきましては、これも後からギャレス・エバンズから話が細かくあると思いますけれども、核兵器の唯一の目的や先制不使用の問題など、意思という極めて難しい分野に踏み込んでおります。さらにもうちょっと内容について、特に日本の方に関心がおありの問題についてお話をさせていただきますと、まず最小化地点、これは2つのフェーズに分けていますので、2025年までを最小化地点と呼んでおりますけれども、この最小化地点における核弾頭の数がいくつかということでございます。これは米ロが核500、そしてその他の核保有国は保有量を増やさない、またその削減することを要請します、するということで、それをその国のその他の核保有国の核を足して総数で2000発を超えないということになっております。これは核保有国の核を解体する能力、それから保有数を公表していない国があるということ、また核武装国、核武装国という言葉は NPT 上の核を保有している国、これはよく核兵器国と呼ばれていますが、それに加えてインド、パキスタン、イスラエルを含んだ定義にしていますけれども、核武装国の直面する安全保障上の問題もございますので、そういったことを考慮して検討した結果でございます。で、この数字のレベルですけれども、現在の総核弾頭数に比べると 90% ぐらいの削減をすることになっていまして、これを達成すること自体は非常に野心的な目標であるわけですけれども、さらにそれだけじゃなくて、スタート後継条約交渉の今米ロでやっていますが、それの早期妥結、そしてそれを前倒しをして実施をしてもらう、そしてその上でさらに削減をしてもらうということも求めている、極めて野心的な扱いをしております。それから過去の報告書と比べてどうだったかということですけれども、その過去の報告書の勧告と比べても遜色がない、そして実際的なタイムテーブル、2025年がミニマイゼーション最小化地点の終わりですので、タイムテーブルを示しているという点でも野心的だということでございます。それからこれもギャレスから後で話がありますが、核ドクトリンこれについてどう書いてあるかということですけれども、核を廃絶していくためには、核の役割を減らしていくということが、これはもう必須であります。そのために核政策の理論面について議論をいたしました。そして先制不使用、 それからそれに先立つ時点で唯一の目的宣言を提案をしています。それから最後にその先制不使用について一言だけ私から申し上げたいと思いますけれども、これは2025年の時点で全核保有国が明確にかつ一致をして先制不使用を宣言するということを提言をしています。それから同時に核兵器国の同盟国であってもそして自らは核兵器を持っていない国、こういった国の安全保障についても化学兵器、生物兵器を含めて受け入れがたい脅威にさらされないという確実な保障を与える、この保障が与えられるということが重要であるというふうに考えています。で、この文脈で化学兵器、生物兵器関連の条約の普遍化を促進するということと、条約の遵守の確保のために一層効果的な方法の開発が非常に重要だというふうに考えています。それから先制不使用政策というのは、実際に配備の体制、警戒体制、あるいは発射の体制に反映をされる必要があります。で、これらのその考慮につきましては、先制不使用政策のその信頼性向上や同盟国の懸念への対応、といったその効果を狙っていますので、そのような観点から、そのような観点で、これは新しい書き方になっているということです。先制不使用政策をはっきり、そういう意味でそういうことを踏まえてまた書いているということです。それから核の先制不使用政策についてのその各校の勧告はどうだったかということについて言いますと、キャンベラ委員会やブリックス委員会は先制不使用について勧告はしていますけれども、この我々の報告書においては、先制不使用政策の問題をその他の他の措置、実際の核弾頭数の削減や、それからその政策と合致をする核兵器の配備体制といったものとの関連で扱っておりまして、この先制不使用政策を核軍縮の文脈で実際に意味のある形で勧告をしているということです。以上、核先制不使用について申し上げました。いずれにしてもその核先制不使用政策が核弾頭数とか、実際のその体制面での対応、これを伴ってこそ先制不使用政策に信頼性、そういった政策に信頼性が与えられるという、そういう考え方をしています。私からは特に日本の方が関心をお持ちになる問題について若干付箋をさせていただきまして、あと全体の話についてはヤレスにフロアを譲りたいと思います。ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Kawaguchi-san. May I begin by expressing my very warm thanks and gratitude to Yoriko Kawaguchi and all her Japanese team for the pleasure and the privilege of working with her and with them over the last year or more. I'll keep this quite short to allow maximum time for questions. But before we plunge into the detail of particular policy recommendations, I think it is important just to stand back for a moment and look at some of the basic themes which do run through the report. And the first message in this respect, with which the report both begins and ends, is that the problem of nuclear weapons makes complacency impossible. Just as with the great global issue of climate change, the destructive potential of nuclear weapons means that the status quo is simply not an option. And in particular, in that respect, the dual standard situation whereby Some states have nuclear weapons and might like to keep them in perpetuity, while at the same time ensuring there is no proliferation, that no other state has nuclear weapons. That's simply not a sustainable or a credible position. Disarmament and non-proliferation are inextricably linked together, and we just have to move forward on all fronts simultaneously and make major progress. The second theme linked to that runs through the report is, of course, that nuclear weapons are the most inherently indiscriminate, inhumane weapons ever invented. And it's simply not tolerable on that ground alone that we be complacent about their continued existence. The risk of their misuse outweighs any conceivable benefit that flows from their retention. We can only be comfortable as an international community when we have achieved the absolute abolition of nuclear weapons. And the final theme running through the report, bringing all those threads together, is the language that was first articulated in the Canberra Commission report 10 years or more ago, and which has been repeated many times since, namely, so long as any state has nuclear weapons, others will want them. So long as any weapons exist, they are bound one day to be used, if not deliberately, then by accident or by miscalculation under operational stress. And any such use would be catastrophic for this planet as we know it. So they're the themes that run very, very strongly through the entire report. When we translate that into policy specifics, there are something like 76 recommendations in the report, and I'm not planning to go through all of them with you, but some of the most significant of them are these. First of all, so far as non-proliferation is concerned, we do come up with a package of recommended outcomes for next May's 2010 NPT review conference, in particular identifying three major issues or groups of issues on which it will be crucial to reach agreement. One is the set of issues related to strengthening the non-proliferation regime, to deal with problems of compliance and enforcement of the kind that we have experienced with North Korea and Iran, to improve the verification and safeguard system, and to strengthen the IAEA itself. A second group of issues, or second big issue, that we have to see agreement reached on is a big statement on disarmament, about the absolute necessity for disarmament to be achieved, and with the major nuclear weapon states joining in such a statement. We had something like that in the year 2000 with the document known as the 13 Practical Steps. That disappeared in 2005. It's very, very important for the politics of commitment by the non-nuclear weapon states, by the rest of the world, that there be serious movement on this front. The Commission report contains a detailed draft 20-point statement on disarmament, which updates the 13 steps of 2000, and which we hope will form the basis for a major discussion at the conference. And I hope that Japan might feel able to take a lead among those countries that are seeking to get a strong statement on disarmament. The third big issue that needs to be dealt with at the NPT conference, I will just mention it in passing, not discuss it, is the need for movement on the question of a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. The Commission's own consultations in Cairo a few weeks, 2 months ago, demonstrated, I think, there is some way forward on this, which may help defuse an issue which is otherwise capable of becoming a quite serious spoiling issue for the success of the conference, as it has potentially been in the past. So the report has a lot to say, very specifically about the NPT review conference, and of course in much more detail about the many, many issues which will also be debated there and which it's important to get right, including, of course, nuclear security and dealing with the problem of loose weapons, loose material, and the implications of that for both proliferation and for terrorist concerns. Moving to the subject of disarmament specifically, the Commission does articulate, as Kawaguchi-san has said, this program in the medium term by which we are arguing for a reduction, dramatic reduction, 90% plus reduction in the number of nuclear warheads in existence over the next 15, 16 years by 2025. Some NGOs, civil society commentators have been a little critical about the goal that we've set, 2,000 maximum over a 15-year time frame. But in the spirit of realism and pragmatism which runs through this report, we frankly felt that it was just impossible to move faster, and it would be a major achievement to get that result in that time frame, given the many obstacles which exist out there. We also argue that by 2025 there should be major changes to the deployment of such weapons as are left, with nothing left on dangerously high alert status, and with most of these weapons that do remain being basically locked away and not able to be very quickly used. We also argue on the subject of nuclear doctrine for the achievement, at least by 2025, but hopefully much sooner than that, of a commitment by all the nuclear armed states to no first use. This is a sensitive issue, as Kawaguchi-san has said, but it's one on which the Commission came to a very strong view, that so long as nuclear weapons exist at all, at the very least the objective ought to be to limit the doctrine quite dramatically, so it's only by way of retaliation for nuclear attack that nuclear weapons are used. We are kept. We acknowledge that it will be quite difficult, given the history, the rather controversial history of this doctrine. It will be difficult to get everyone signed up to that very quickly. But there is a way forward just in the next 2 or 3 months which would make a fundamental difference in this respect. And that would be if the United States, in its current nuclear posture review, were to adopt, if not exact no first use language, at least something very, very close to that, namely a declaration that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons, so long as they remain, should be to deter other states from using such weapons against oneself or one's allies. It's extremely important issue to get right, because if the US does move down this particular path, this would send a hugely important signal to the other countries of the world in the context of the NPT review conference and in many other situations as well, including the negotiators in Geneva working on the Fissile Material Treaty. It would be a very big thing indeed to occur, and a very helpful thing for the disarmament cause. The Commission is very conscious that this is, even if you don't express it in no first use terms, even if you only talk about it in sole purpose declaration terms, we are conscious that this is a sensitive issue here in Northeast Asia and for Japan in particular. But we do argue that if you are going to get serious about nuclear disarmament, the world does have to move sooner rather than later to an acceptance that nuclear weapons should not be used for anything other than retaliation for or deterrence against potential nuclear attack. Not for chemical, not for biological, not for cyber, not for conventional, only for nuclear. And then, of course, you want to achieve ultimately the final removal altogether. But this is what's got to happen if we're going to move in that direction. And I think it's very important in that context, as Yoriko has said, that the United States give its allies very, very solid guarantees that if it does move down that particular path, as the Commission believes it should, then its allies should be given very strong reassurance that the military capability of the United States will be available and used to deal with any other threat contingency, non-nuclear threat contingency that might still arise in the future. So what we're talking about is not the abandonment of extended deterrence. What we're simply talking about is the limitation of nuclear deterrence, so that you have extended deterrence, but you don't have extended nuclear deterrence. Nuclear deterrence is available only for nuclear threats. We don't know what the United States will do. It's a lively debate in the US at the moment. We've been discussing this subject with the Foreign Minister, and today, as we've been discussing this on many occasions over the last year. So it's a very important issue on which we hope that early movement will happen. In the longer term, of course, beyond 2025, we do argue for the fastest possible movement from there to zero nuclear weapons. We have not tried to put a target date for getting to zero, simply because it's too difficult and would not be a credible thing, we believe, as a Commission to do. We have the issues to address of the general geopolitical environment. We have particular geopolitical problems in regions like South Asia and the Middle East, which clearly would have to stabilize if we're going to get to a zero world. We have the psychological problem. We still have to change the mindset of reliance psychologically on nuclear weapons, even though rationally they cause far more problems than they're worth. And we have problems of establishing a verification system that everyone is confident in. We have problems in establishing an enforcement system globally that everyone is confident in before we can get to zero. The Commission is very clear about what those obstacles are. We do think they can be overcome, but we can't be clear about how long it will take. We think we can step down to the minimization point fairly quickly, but we do acknowledge that getting from there to zero will be tougher. There are many other issues in the report, just one that I will mention finally, and that is very strong support by the Commission for the further development of civil nuclear energy, but subject very much to what Japan has described as the 3 S's: effective security, effective safeguards, and effective safety measures. And we argue with much more attention being necessary in the future for proliferation-resistant technologies of one kind or another, and also, very importantly, to creating disincentives to states building their own enrichment and reprocessing facilities. Some have called enrichment of uranium at the front end of the fuel cycle, reprocessing plutonium at the back end. Some people have called these kinds of facilities bomb starter kits. Well, that might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's not too much of an exaggeration. We've seen the dangers that can arise, and that makes very important the efforts currently being made to provide guaranteed fuel assurances or other forms of internationalization or multilateralization of the fuel cycle at these sensitive points. As I said, there are many other major issues dealt with in the report. The initial response to it in the discussions that I, for example, have been having in just the last week in Washington, in Moscow, and to NATO people in Warsaw and in London, and in other consultations we've had over the last few months as we've described the kind of recommendations that we are making to other governments. The response has been intensely interested, I think it's fair to say, so far as governments right across the world are concerned. I think they are looking to this report for detailed analysis, argument, new ideas, and above all, a roadmap for the future to translate these very general principles that have been articulated by President Obama and others into very specific policy action in the years ahead. So we do hope the report has a positive impact in this respect. The signs so far are good, but that also depends on the way in which you guys write about it. So we look to you for a very positive response to the report and help in presenting its message, not only to a Japanese audience, but to the wider world. Thank you.
ありがとうございました。リポートはですね、そこに今エヴァンさんがお持ちですけど、Could I ask you to show me? このぐらい厚いものでして、300ページぐらいあるんでしょうか。この日本語訳というのが数ヶ月後にはおそらく出版されることになると思います。で、本日はですね、プレスキットの中に入ってましたこのシノプシスを前提として議論を進めていきたいと思います。それでは会場の皆様からご質問をお受けいたします。挙手の上、所属と名前を名乗った上で、質問をしていただきたいと思います。それではどうぞ。どうぞ。はい、マイクロフォンでお願いします。
日本テレビ報道局の福井と申します。お願いします。2点ありまして、1点はまず先ほど川口議長の方からは、この報告書の特徴という形で評価というか、売りの部分というかをご説明いただいたと思うんですけれども、エバンス議長の方からも、この報告書の評価、売りの部分というのをちょっと簡潔に言っていただきたいなということが1点です。で次に2点目ですが、どちらのお二人からも両方から出たかと思うんですが、2025年の時点で核保有国が明確に、ノンファーストユースを宣言するという部分で、そのためには核兵器国の同盟国の安全保障が重要だというふうな、文脈でお話が、お二人からあったと思います。その部分で、核兵器国の同盟国もうその状況をただ待っているだけではなくて、自分たちからも何らかのアクションをしていかなければならないと思うんですけれども、それについては具体的にどのようにお考えでしょうか、どのようにまとまったのでしょうか。今のは一般論ということですけれども、もしもう少し踏み込んでお答えがいただけるようでしたら、日本、これまで、先制不使用には支持を表明してこなかった日本はどのようなことをしなければならないとお考えでしょうか。お願いします。
Well, in terms of the selling points of the report, in general terms, it's comprehensive, it's timely, it's detailed, and it's practical. And that's what policymakers want. The specific issues that are most immediately relevant are essentially the ones that I mentioned. A strong package of useful proposals for policymakers to take to the NPT review conference, a strong roadmap for achieving disarmament, not just talking about disarmament in the abstract, but describing specifically how we can get there by stages, and a very strong position on nuclear civil energy in support of that energy as a very, very important contribution to the world's energy supplies in the future, particularly with the climate change problem. But also needing very close attention to the issue of proliferation resistance, both institutionally and technically. The selling points essentially are that we've addressed all the major issues, we've come up with specific policy proposals, we've talked about it in a way that policymakers will find practical, not just a kind of a laundry list of the world should be a better place in these following 50 ways. We've been much more explicit. In terms of your question about the allies, I'll leave it to Yoriko perhaps to say some more words on that subject. But what we're saying is that allies of the United States, and for that matter of other nuclear weapon states, deserve the support of the weapon states in terms of their own security needs. And if we are to move towards reduced reliance on nuclear weapons to deal with a whole array of threats, that must mean an ability still to rely on conventional weapons, non-nuclear weapons, to deal with any kind of threat that might arise. And that's something the Allies should not have to wait for. That's something they should reasonably ask for right at the beginning of the process. The important contribution that Allies can make is, if they are serious about a nuclear weapons-free world, is to accept changes in doctrine of this kind and say that's the logic of getting to disarmament. That's where we have to be. So I think it would be, to answer your very last question about what Japan should do in relation to the no first use issue, I think it would be very helpful if Japan were to communicate, not necessarily publicly, but maybe privately, to the US government that it could live with a change in doctrine of this kind, a sole purpose doctrine, something like that. It could live with that provided it was given appropriate assurances for conventional protection against any possible threat, including really nasty threats like biological weapons and so on that might arise in the future. I think that's what Japan should do. I suspect that's the kind of direction that Australia will take. We've been rather ambiguous on this issue in the past. We've rather liked the idea of nuclear weapons being available for all sorts of contingencies. I think we will probably move, not immediately, it will take some time to discuss, but I think we will move in that direction. And I hope it's the direction that NATO will move in too. I was talking to NATO conference in Warsaw just 4 or 5 days ago. And there are very divided opinions in NATO on this. There are some people in NATO who remind me of Dr. Strangelove and Curtis LeMay in their enthusiasm for having nuclear weapons available to deal with everything in sight. There's certainly some people in the system who love them with a passion, but I suspect that the balance, the majority sentiment among the NATO countries is rather as was articulated, after all, by some very hard-headed Cold War realists, Kissinger, Nunn, Schultz and Perry, just a couple of years ago. I suspect the majority view is theirs, namely whatever role nuclear weapons may have played in the past in stabilizing the situation during the Cold War, now, in the world as it now is, they create far more risks than they provide benefits. So I believe that's the way we're heading on this. Hopefully our report will accelerate that process, and hopefully the Japanese government will be supportive of a move in that direction. I think it would be very consistent with Japan's long-standing, very passionate view about the horror of nuclear weapons. I've listened to the hibakusha. We know the story. It's a terrible story. None of us want to see it repeated. Japan feels very passionately about it. But if we're going to get there, we've got to make some hard policy decisions, all of us, along the way. And that's the message of this report.
とてもいいご質問だと思います。いくつか申し上げたいことがありますけれども、まず基本的な問題として、この核についての考え方を変える、ということをしないと核は減っていかない、ということですから、そういう意味でその、ソウルパーパスのその宣言、あるいは先制不使用の宣言は大事だ、ということです。でこれは2025年と言いましたけれども、遅くとも2025年、というふうに我々は報告書で書いている、ということです。それからもう一つは、核を減らしていくことのために必要なのはそのステートメントだけではなくて、例えば CTBT が発効するとか、あるいはその FMCT が、条約の交渉が始まるとか、たくさん他のことがあるわけで、そういうことをやっていかないとステートメントだけでは問題は解決しないので、そういう他のことを同時にやっていかなければいけない。で日本は CTBT の発効についてずっと今まで働きかけをやってきましたし、 FMCT もそうですし、そういったことを、引き続きかなり強力にやっていかなければいけない、ということが ことが一つあります。それからもう一つは、今のこの時代、物事を秘密裏にやるというのは非常に難しい、わけでございまして、やはり、核についての核の抑止、ということが一体どういうことなのか、通常兵器で、どこまで抑止できるのか、通常兵器でも大丈夫なんだということについて、日本の国民に確信を持ってもらわないといけないですね。でこのために、国内であるいはそのアメリカとの、今までその、核抑止および他の抑止を与えてくれているのがアメリカですから、そういう国と日本を守るためにどういう抑止が必要なんだということをきちんと話し合っていかないといけないと思います。でこれは日本が守られているというふうに日本人が思わなければ、北朝鮮のその核の問題もありますし、中国も核を増やしているというふうにも聞いていますから、安心しない。で安心しなければできないんですね。ですからそういう意味で話し合っていく、ということが必要だと思います。そういう話し合いを今まであんまり私は日本で安全保障やあるいはどういう形の抑止が日本のために必要かということについての国民的な議論が行われてきていないと思うんですね。そういったことを国内でやっていかないといけないというふうに私は思っています。でもう一つそれとの関係で、例えば6カ国協議で日本が日本もメンバーですから、これを進めるということへの努力ですとか、あるいは化学兵器、あるいは生物兵器、それの普遍化とかその検証とか、そういった問題にも日本が努力をしていくことが必要で、それが総合全部、合わさった形で、日本人がどういう形の抑止を持つか、要するに核なしで、通常兵器で、抑止をする、先制核は抑止のためにしか、核に対する抑止のためにしか使わないわけですから、生物兵器とか化学兵器に対してどういうことで抑止をするかとか、そういった問題についての安心感を持つために大事だと思います。ですから非常にたくさんのことをやらなければいけないと思っています。
はい、それでは続いてどちらの方どうぞ。
I'm Masahiko Sasajima from the Yomiuri Shimbun newspaper. I have 3 questions, and my question goes to Professor Evans. And first of all, do you believe that North Korea and Iran will renounce their nuclear weapons development programs if the United States and other nuclear power declare that no first use options? This is my first question. Secondly, the United States and DPRK talked about their futures last week, and they confirmed that the importance of the joint statement of 6-party talk in 1995. And according to that joint statement, United States has already made a commitment. United States would not attack North Korea by nuclear or conventional weapons. So why do you need to urge the United States to declare that no first use options? This is my second question. According to that report in the English version, this version referred to the Pentagon's operational plan 8010-08. It looks like your report tried to oppose to the American nuclear strategy, and it looks like it sounds like an anti-American strategies. And in the Japanese version, this Japanese version doesn't include that American strategies. So I guess that there is some political intentions. And thirdly, according to your report, you mentioned that the allies in question should be given firm assurance that they will not be exposed to unacceptable risk from other sources, including especially biological and chemical weapons. But then that who will assure that Japan would not be attacked by chemical or biological weapons from North Korea? North Korea will assure for us, or other nation will assure for us? This is my third question. Thank you.
Well, might I say at the outset that if anything in this report is anti-American, that would come as great news to President Obama, because just about everything in this report is entirely consistent with the themes that he articulated in his Prague speech, and which he is clearly keen to implement. A number of your questions were built around the notion that why on earth would a determined proliferator take any notice of whatever the nuclear armed states do by way of either disarming or coming up with changes in their doctrine of this kind. The argument is not, none of us are that naive. The argument is not that countries like DPRK and Iran and others will be so awestruck, will be so overcome by reverence by this big move by the nuclear armed states, that they will renounce all such ambition. No, that's not the way the world works. We're not pretending that. What we do say, basically, is that if you are to have effective non-proliferation disciplines, if you are to have agreement in the Security Council on the application of sanctions, if you are to have agreement in the NPT Review Conference, if you're to have agreement in the IAEA Board of Governors about determining non-compliance with the NPT, or if you have agreement in the IAEA Board of Governors about a fuel bank alternative for the future to stop us going down the path of bomb starter kits, if you're going to have agreement in the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva and no problems of blockages to consensus, if you're going to have all those things, you've got to have buy-in, you've got to have commitment, you've got to have support from many, many, many other countries around the world. And the truth of the matter is, so long as those countries believe that the nuclear weapon states are not serious about disarmament, then you just don't get that cooperation. Compare the cooperation that was there in '95 when the indefinite extension of the NPT was agreed. That was against the background of a massive reduction in nuclear weapons at the end of the Cold War, from 70,000 something down to 25,000. Compare the last 10 years where there's been zero movement, very, very little cooperation on these issues. It's been very largely associated with a perception that the weapon states, and in particular the US under the previous administration, were not serious about arms control. Compare that with the perception we now have with the arrival of President Obama, his big speeches and so on. We're serious about this, and all of a sudden we start getting movement in Geneva at the Conference on Disarmament. We get agreement in the preparatory process for the NPT Review Conference about an agenda and so on. This is the argument, that if you want cooperation, you've got to start getting rid of the double standards and the appearance of the double standard. That's the argument. It's a more sophisticated argument than the one I constantly hear from various people in the US and elsewhere. They say you're so naive. Why should anyone pay any attention to what the nuclear states do? So really that's the story. I mean, in no first use and negative security assurances and all these things, extended deterrence and limiting that so it's not extended nuclear deterrence but just extended deterrence, all of this is part of the strategy of demonstrating to the world as a whole that the nuclear armed states are serious about moving down the disarmament path. And against that background, we can hope for better things on other fronts. Of course, the North Korean issue, DPRK issue, has its own dynamic, has its own difficulties. The report is reasonably optimistic that at the end of the day, those difficulties can be resolved. That is not necessarily the case, that the DPRK is committed in perpetuity to having nuclear weapons. We think they can possibly be argued or pressured out of it. That remains to be seen, but I don't think you'll find anything naive in the report in this respect. But you will find a sense that you have to seek negotiated solutions to these problems rather than military ones. There's much more to say on all these issues, but we're taking too much time, so I'll leave it to the next question.
一つだけ、先ほど日本語には書いてないけれども英語に書いてあるというふうにおっしゃったんですが、誤解があるといけませんので、この日本語のこれは、この英語でいうシノプシスの訳なんです。ですから、この先ほどのおっしゃった引用されたのはドキュメントのインフォメーションシートのいくつを見ていらしたのか、いくつですか、ナンバー9ですか、見て、おっしゃったとしても、これはそのこれの訳ではない。それでインフォメーションシートは逆に今翻訳をしていますけれども、この分厚い、本に書いてあることを、ほぼそこに写して書いているということなので、英語と日本語が違うことが書いてあるということはありません。念のために申し上げておきます。
はい、それでは続いて質問をお受けします。どうぞ。
共同通信の土屋と申します。ちょっと川口先生に質問なんですけれども、そのソウルパーパスですね、これをアメリカの NPR に盛り込むこと非常に重要であるという提言がありますですね。でこれがあるということはこれまであまり早い時期にソウルパーパスなど宣言をすることはあまり日本側としては好ましくないというふうなですね議論があってきたと思うんですけれども、それが解消されたのかということ、それからその条件としては多分ですね、その微子兵器などによる脅威から、保障されることというのがまた別途あると思うんですけれども、そうした中ですね、日本側で特に北朝鮮のですね微子兵器に対しては、通常兵器での抑止が可能だというような認識に達したのか、共通認識ですね、あるいはそれとも、やはり核による、抑止が必要だという議論もありつつも、この形になったのか、ちょっとその辺の議論をですね、紹介していただければと思うんですけれども、どのような議論があったかですか。
チャタムハウスルールというのがありまして、あまりどういう議論がされたかということについては、外では言わないということになっているんですが、若干、ルールを犯して、申し上げますと、この、ギャレスが後でもし訂正することがあればしてもらえると思いますけれども、ノーファーストユースあるいはソウルパーパスの議論はかなりの時間を使ってやりました。でいろんな意見がありました。で2つありまして、1つはまさに今おっしゃった、通常兵器で要するに核以外のものを持って、北朝鮮か、どこか知りませんけれども、いずれにしてもその、生物兵器化学兵器を抑止できるかという議論、それからもう一つはどの時期に、これを言うことがいいかという2点についていろいろ議論があったというふうに思います。それでこれ結論的に言えばここに、書いてあることが、みんなの、いろんな意見はありましたけれども、考え方としてまとまったところである、ということで、ございます。誰もレザベーションはつけていないし、反対だと言って部屋をウォークアウトした人もいません。ということなんですけれども、それでなんでまず最初のその通常兵器 他の兵器では、要するに核でなくても生物兵器、化学兵器を抑止できるかということですけれども、先ほど私、別な方の質問について言いましたけれども、化学兵器、あるいはその生物兵器の不変化ということが大事であるということは書いてありまして、それの努力はしなければならない。で、検証も必要だということも書いてあります。それからタイミングについて先ほど言いましたように、2012年にソウルパーパスのステートメントをし、もしそこでできなければその後にできるだけ早くそれを行い、そして、遅くとも2025年には体制の、配備体制できちんとその表明される具体化されたノーファーストユースを出す、ということで、まとまったという、そういうことです。
はい、それではどうぞ。
Thank you for taking my question. I'm Maegawa from Asahi Shimbun, reporter for the international news section. I'd like to ask a question to Mr. Gareth Evans. My question is about the political clout that this report could have, because in the sense that you already know that given the situation in Russia and U.S. negotiation has not been concluded by the expiring date of the December 5th of the START 1, I guess the 2,000 warheads by 2050, 2025, yes, would be a very ambitious and supposedly probably too ambitious. And I'd like to ask you to explain about how realistic you think about this number, because this does not mention anything about the China's warhead or China disarmament by the end of 2055. Thank you.
If I may, first of all, on the US-Russia bilateral treaty negotiations at the moment, I've just spent one day in Moscow and one day in Washington in the last week talking to people about this, and all I can say is there's quite a high level of confidence in both capitals that the remaining small areas of difference between them will be resolved, and there will be some kind of announcement before the end of this year, maybe in the margins of Copenhagen. Now, something can always go wrong, but that was the expectation. They're arguing about verification issues of a high level of complexity, but I don't think there's any basic disagreement about the necessity for that treaty to continue. The real difficulty will be to get the next stage of deep reduction negotiations started between and concluded between Russia and the US. And when that the issues there are going to include some very difficult ones, tactical nuclear weapons, whereas the argument so far has just been about deployed strategic weapons. The issue of conventional arms imbalance is going to come centre stage, in particular concerns being expressed by the Russians, also by the Chinese, incidentally, about American capability, particularly strapping precision-guided munitions onto big intercontinental missiles with the damage that they can cause to nuclear capability. The issue of ballistic missile defence is going to also come into play. The report is very realistic about all these difficulties, and that's one of the reasons why we are cautious in terms of the numbers that we specify, the timetable. But we do believe that the 2025 target can be met. What we're talking about is down to 2,000, 13,000 Russian warheads down to 500, 9,000 American warheads down to 500, and no increases from the assumed maximum for all the other that are there now for all the other countries. That will be difficult because China is probably increasing at the moment, India, Pakistan probably also at the moment, and the job there is to hold the line against increases. But those numbers look very big, 13 down to 500, 9,000 down to 500. How on earth could that happen? Well, just remember that when there was a political will to do this sort of stuff in the years immediately after the end of the Cold War, we saw a reduction of something like 70,000 weapons down to the mid-20,000s in just the space of a very few years. There are issues of dismantlement capability, because that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about weapons just not deployed. We're talking about weapons being destroyed. There's dismantlement capability issues, which will arise not for the US, they can do that easily. Russians will be more difficult because some of their facilities have closed up of the kind that existed during that early 90s period. But we've made the calculation that this can be done, assuming a significant degree of political will and assuming this thing gaining momentum in the way that we're suggesting is possible. So that's why these other issues like doctrine and so on are so important. If you can start getting these decisions being made, more cooperation from other states on non-proliferation issues, that feeds back into a kind of a virtuous, self-reinforcing cycle. And what looks very tough at the moment might look rather less tough as the years go by. That's an optimistic version of it, but the whole report sort of tries to balance the idealism with the realism of these judgments about just how you can move forward in a very difficult environment.
はい、ちょうど時間はだいぶ過ぎちゃったんですけれども、もう一問最後の質問を答えていただく時間ありましょうか。
Sorry, I missed that.
One more question.
One more, sure.
では最後の質問ということで、それでは一番後ろの方どうぞ。
川口さんに
スイッチが入ってます。
川口さんに端的に答えていただきたい、短くていいんで端的に答えていただきたいんですけれども、改めてこの報告書の意義、国民の人に世界の人に分かりやすくこの報告書の意義とで日本国民に対して、日本という国はその先制不使用という中で難しい課題を抱えながら日本政府にはどういうリーダーシップを取ってほしいのかということを、端的にお答えいただければと思います。
短く答える質問が一番難しいんですけれども、まず最初の方の、この報告書の特徴、ということですけれども、核兵器は使えない兵器である、ということを、書いてありまして、であればどうやってそれをゼロにしていくかということを実際のステップを踏んで、それをやってもらえればゼロになるところに至りますという形で分かりやすく書いてある報告書であるということです。で、日本政府への希望はこれを政策に反映をしてほしいということです。
はい、どうもありがとうございました。川口さん、エバンスさんは2度にわたり当クラブに来ていただきまして大変感謝したいと思います。で、恒例ですが記者クラブの方から記念品をお送りしたいと思います。どうもありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。Thank you. ありがとうございました。